So a question I'll just pose right now to come back to later is, will there be another nutritional transition from this current regime to what I see coming with higher income populations, which is moving away from those bad foods to interesting other mixes of good foods? Yeah. We can hope.
Well, only if the economics are good.
Well, that goes without saying.
It'll be a disaster transition.
So I just am going to take a few minutes to give you, try to give a little bit of, as Jim said, a little bit of the language and a little bit of the perspective coming from economics about economic modeling and then how it relates to climate impact assessment. And so I'll talk a bit about types of economic models, and then I'm going to say a few words about putting weather and climate into economic models. That's not something that's always done at all, in fact. Key challenges in using economic models for climate assessment, and then I'll just finish by taking that and putting it into this integrated assessment framework that AgMIP and many other modeling members of the modeling community have been using, just to illustrate a couple key challenges as we go forward. So first of all, a little bit of jargon. We all hear about macroeconomics, and every day we're pummeled with the media about things like interest rates and when is the Fed gonna loosen and blah blah blah. The whole world of macroeconomics is not the economic models we're going to be talking about here. So I just wanted to make that point up front. Now, in some of the integrated assessment models, some economists would probably say there are some elements of macro models that have kind of found their way into what we now might call integrated assessment models. The second category of economic models that I'm going to call trade policy models, but what they really are is they are models of markets. And they can operate at various levels. The ones we're going to talk about here, I think, mostly because of the modeling teams that have been involved with AgMIP, particularly looking at climate impact assessment and doing intercomparison, are really models that were originally created to do trade policy analysis and related kinds of policy analysis, and over time got drawn into the climate impact assessment world. They were not originally climate impact assessment models. And they, very importantly, are models in what we economists call in real terms, meaning when I talk about a price in 2010 versus a price in 2050, it's in the same units of, let's say, $2010, not so-called nominal units, reflecting inflation, the change in the value of money. And likewise with income and the other measures they use. And they are basically models, like I said, market models that equate supply and demand at various levels, can be nationally, can be subnationally, can be multi-country regions, et cetera, globally, and basically tell us about prices, production, consumption, and trade, as well as some other things, but that's really their main focus. They can be what we call partial or general equilibrium. Won't spend any time really elaborating on that, but partial equilibrium models take certain things fixed and look at how a market works. The classic partial equilibrium model in economics is just supply and demand of a single market. And everything else that determines demand and supply outside of that market is taken from the outside. General equilibrium models are generally models that sort of try to solve for, you could say, more or less everything simultaneously, but of course no model can solve for everything. All models have to have some exogenous stuff, some drivers feeding them. These models are done at subnational to multinational spatial scales for supply and demand. In contrast, I'm going to talk a little bit about microeconomic models, and there are many of these. And that's part of our problem when we get down to the more microeconomic models. But the key thing for our discussions here this week, I think, is that these are price-taking models. In other words, they are not market models. Prices are an input into them, a driver, a given, an exogenous factor. They don't determine prices, but they use prices as information for people to make economic decisions. And in particular, we'll be talking, I think, a lot about models of farm households and their decisions. There are also other more regional, by that I mean subnational to national scale models that look at particular kinds of resource allocation decisions, like land use or water use, for example. And these models answer questions related to things like technology adoption, farm level production, income of the farm household, consumption, and various other social indicators of well-being are incorporated in various kinds of models. And increasingly ones relating to what Adam was just talking about that inform, that allow us to construct metrics related to nutrition and health. And of course, food security is one of the classic ones that is talked about a lot, but also, again, not often, in fact, included in a formal way. We have indicators, for example, long-standing indicators in economics for poverty measurement. And in fact, for the most part, the social indicators like food security indicators that are quantified are really income-based indicators that translate from income into some other outcomes like how much food you consume and so they're really kind of a translation of that basic income and price information into how much either just calories you can consume, are you above or below a calorie threshold, or some other more sophisticated nutritional indicator. And there's been work done on health and other things too, gender aspects of, various aspects of gender as well. Many of these models are individual household and often described as, quote, representative in some sense, maybe of some stratum of a population, small farms versus large farms, et cetera. Or some models are trying to represent a heterogeneous household population, like the kind of model that I've developed and worked on a lot. And often these models are implemented at a community or a village scale or a subnational region, and sometimes extended out to a national scale as well. So we've got a lot of models in economics. They're very heterogeneous. They've been designed to do all kinds of different things. You know, I could spend all day talking about all kinds of economic models. This is just kind of one little slice of it, ones that relate to what I think we're doing here. And then along came this issue of climate change. And so economists started to say, oh, see, how do we put climate or weather or that stuff into these models that we do? And here I'm going to introduce some terminology that economists basically use. And so we have this notion of a production function. Crop modelers would call it a crop simulation model. Livestock people would probably call it a livestock model of some sort, production model. The classic economic production function talks about things like capital, labor, energy, materials, technology. Those are inputs that give rise to some output measured, and these can be done from the firm level all the way up to a whole economy. Various levels of aggregation. In agriculture, that idea has been specialized to sort of the agricultural production function that classically included land, labor, seeds, nutrients, fertilizer, chemicals for pest control, for example. Often in the economics world, soils and water were not explicitly, maybe you included an irrigation variable for fields that were irrigated or not irrigated. You might have some sort of ad hoc variables to represent soil quality. Weather was often, typically in these models, treated as just random noise that hit the production process, was not represented explicitly. But over time, as people started to work more on climate and get weather data, nowadays actually there are a lot of economists who are doing various kinds of economic models, in some way a spin-off of this economic production function concept and some generalizations of it. For example, rather than physical output as a dependent variable, I could look at revenue or net returns, gross margins, things like that. But also started to say, oh, well, we actually have weather or climate data. We could actually put those things explicitly in these models. And most of these models have been traditionally statistical or econometric models as opposed to process-based models. But this is very much analogous to what the agronomist would think of as a crop model. But lacking all of that underlying process knowledge, rather just a statistical relationship. Trade policy models take that concept of a production function and translate it into a commodity supply curve. And so if climate or weather impacts production or productivity, it translates into a shift in the supply curve in the classic, Econ 101 supply and demand diagram sort of sense. And those household models that I was talking about, on the other hand, take that production function and look at the household either as just a production system sense or perhaps, and often more generally, as linking household consumption behavior and other behavior along with that production part. One example of the so-called trade policy model that has been sort of morphed into an integrated assessment model for climate assessment and other things is the IFPRI impact model, which was originally a partial equilibrium trade policy model. And this box here basically represents the sort of traditional modeling of supply and demand and trade. It's now been linked to some water modeling, and it's been linked to some scenario designs that are used, of course, for the policy analysis as well as for climate impact type of assessment. But these now have become large, complex models. On the other hand, going to the micro level, down to this individual household farming system type model, of which there are many. A recent review article cited over 100 studies, not 100 different models, but a large number of different models, typically built for very specific studies. And some of them are so-called optimization models, some of them are simulation models, but they all basically are trying to look at different kinds of decisions, resource allocation decisions. What should I produce? How should I produce it? What should I consume in the household? And as you can see in this elaboration, which I don't have time to, of course, to go into all the little boxes and arrows, but we have basically a production system component, a farming system component, and a household decision component that, for example, relates to things like family labor allocation between household activities, farm production activities, off-farm labor, food consumption, child rearing, health care, food preparation. One can, in principle, elaborate it in many ways. But of course, huge data demands to elaborate a model at this level of detail. But if one really wanted to seriously address some of the kinds of metrics that Adam was talking about, one would probably ideally want to go to this high level of detail. So let me finish. How am I doing on time, Jim? Okay, good. A few comments on key challenges then within these two sort of modeling worlds, the micro and the more aggregate. One is, as I said, putting weather and climate into these models. So thinking of climate as a distribution of weather, the farm and aggregate supply modeling world basically are in some way trying to represent farm and aggregate supply as a function of weather or climate variables. And what we're really doing is coming up with what I now like to describe as a hybrid kind of model, where many modeling teams now are using the biophysical, process-based crop and livestock models to tell us how weather or climate impact productivity. And then we take that productivity impact information and combine it with those economic production function-based models in those structures, either that trade policy sort of integrated assessment model structure or this more disaggregate microeconomic modeling framework. So, but there's, as you would imagine, there's a lot of discussion among economists about how to do that. And in fact, there's a huge debate between economists over whether one should even use the process-based models linked to economic models or not. I won't go there right now, but believe me, there is such a debate. A special issue of a journal is coming out in a few months with a symposium on that very topic. A second key challenge is linking global trade models to these more microeconomic, I'm just saying 2 household farming system models, but you could replace household farming system models with any of the various microeconomic style models. This bridging scales and complexities. It's not just a scale issue, because in economics, there is this whole range of different levels of aggregation. And in both spatial and temporal sense, but also in the sense of households, commodities, etc. So these trade models are using various spatial and temporal scales, and they are fundamentally, like I said, commodity market supply and demand models. So they have a market for maize, a market for wheat, a market for sugar. Whereas at the household, particularly, of course, in the developing world, where we don't have monoculture, we in fact have these complex farming systems and the household interactions, we have these very much more detailed representations of inputs, management, cost of production, outputs, and also behavior. And so there are some real conceptual questions about how we link these two pieces together because of that. And frankly, we economists have not resolved this. It's just sort of out there. Some people work at this scale, some people work at this scale. This scale is an aggregation of these guys, but it is not done explicitly. And it's one of these, 800-pound gorillas in the room that we just kind of, most of us, tend to not worry too much about. Another key challenge is, and this is another one that we tend not to talk too much about because it's so hard, we just don't want to talk about it too much, but how to predict or project out of sample. Now, in the economics world, some models, like the classic macro models, are used for short-term prediction, actually, to some degree. And of course, people working in industry are predicting demand, for next year, et cetera. But when we get to longer-term prediction or projection, where 2 fundamental problems, those drivers, where do we get the drivers? Problem number 1. Problem number 2, parameter stability. Are the parameters I estimated with my historical data legitimate? Notice that if I estimated with historical statistical data, they embed the world, the historical world. Now, if I want to project even 5 years into the future, not to mention 30, 40, 50, 60, are those parameters meaningful? Probably not, in fact. So this issue of stability over time and space is a huge issue that just really hasn't been I don't think, fairly addressed. And then finally, how to evaluate model uncertainty. We really haven't taken this on effectively at all. The recent AgMIP global economic modeling study is really the first major attempt to do that, I think it's fair to say. Dominique, is that a fair statement? And pretty much anywhere in economics among modeling. I mean, a serious model intercomparison exercise.
Well, there's EMF.
Yeah, and the Energy Modeling Forum has done in the sort of energy modeling some aspects of the integrated assessment modeling world, really. And in the more microeconomic area, we just simply haven't done it. The models are so different, and everybody does their own model and is happy. Well, let me finish. How many minutes, Jim? -3?
-2.
Oh, -2. Okay, I'll finish up very quickly. So just to put it into this integrated assessment framework, here's the kind of the stylized integrated assessment framework that most modeling teams are using. Climate information going into biophysical models, producing, for example, crop yields that inform economic models about productivity effects of climate that lead to outputs like production, consumption, food security indicators. And feeding into these are scenarios and different assumptions about how systems might adapt or respond to climate. But notice that this is essentially one scale here in a sense, and think of it as how these global economic impact assessment models are working. But we do have several disciplines being combined. But when we try to go across scales now, it gets way more complicated. So here's a diagram that Roberto Valdivia and I developed a while back, where we tried to start looking, for example, and actually you'll notice here that I've got, in effect, 3 columns going across sort of spatial scales, and then we've got this way, we've got biophysical scenarios and economic modeling. And things that are being determined at one scale, like prices, are drivers at another scale and so forth. And so, yeah, it becomes very complex. And the idea, for example, at one scale, that we might be able to mix and match RCPs and scenarios and do different combinations, for example, it gets very different when, in fact, a scenario at one level becomes an input, generates inputs at another level. So these are some of the fundamental issues that we have to deal with and come some kind of resolution is how we're going to deal with these issues if we're going to go forward with this coordinated modeling. So I'll stop there, Jim. Thanks.